Hallo en welkom bij Fack TV. Creativiteit en creativiteit in het onderwijs, dat blijft ons fascineren. Na een onderwijsprijs, een creatoraat en een boek over creativiteit zijn wij, Joris en Coen, zeker nog niet klaar. Onze fascinatie voor creativiteit leidt ons tot een zoektocht naar het nut van de brainstorm in creatieve processen. Is de huidige opzet wel goed genoeg? Of kunnen we onze hypothese, Fack the brainstorm, over een aantal maanden bevestigen? We gaan op onderzoek uit. Vandaag, nieuwe gast in onze podcast. We hebben Jorge Alves Lino uitgenodigd. Een zeer gewaardeerde, mooi naam.
Vertel de mensen even, wie is dat?
Ja, dat is, Jorge is een collega van ons en die is lector bij een van onze Fontes Centers of Expertise bij Creative Economy. Hij is een aantal jaren en is bezig om te kijken hoe een stuk creativiteit eigenlijk verbonden kan worden tussen verschillende instituten. Hè? Dus hij zorgt voor een soort samenwerking met allerlei verschillende instituten. Daar werken dan weer onderzoekers aan om te kijken hoe we mensen kunnen helpen om hun creatief vermogen te ontwikkelen, maar ook om die verbindingen beter met elkaar te maken, zodat je van elkaar kan leren. Dus nogal een uitdagende job.
Nou, super interessant natuurlijk.
Ja.
Dus, daar gaan we vanuit, zo bij voorbaat. George spreekt Engels, hè? Hoe gaan we dat doen?
Nou, de afspraak is die we even hebben gemaakt hebben. George vindt het fijner om Engels te spreken, maar we kunnen gewoon een vraag in het Nederlands stellen. Nou.
Oh, praktisch. Nou,
dus we hebben eigenlijk een beetje een duaal gebeuren.
Ja.
Waarschijnlijk zul je dan af en toe een beetje half Engels, half Nederlands gaan praten, jou kennen, maar dat komt
dat wou ik zeggen, ja. Hey mensen, we gaan het zien. Veel luisterplezier.
According to you, what's your definition of brainstorming?
Oh, dat vind ik dat is best wel lastig.
Ja en nee, Coen, want het is natuurlijk ook gewoon zo dat brainstorming is dat proces van eerst divergerend denken. Het is veel domme wilde ideeën bedenken. Op een gegeven moment die fase afsluiten en dan convergerend gaan denken en gaan bepalen, welke ideeën zijn nou echt de moeite waard om verder uit te werken. En dat gestructureerd doen, dat is dan eigenlijk denk ik de brainstorm zoals we hem in dit geval zouden definiëren.
Okay, because you know the concept of bringing people together and having ideas, and it can be processmatic, maar people can come together and have ideas together in different parts of a context. You can come together and share ideas about the context in itself and identifying what the purpose is and what exactly is the situation that you want to change, whether it's a product, whatever. I call it a situation because it's slightly more abstract than a product. But you also have the same process in then, okay, once you identified it, what kind of direction would you take to tackle a certain change?
Nou, misschien moeten we dan hier gewoon wat meer context aanbrengen, hè, om dat helder te krijgen en zeggen van, wat we eigenlijk voor ons zien en wat ook een beetje ons probleem is dat we aan studenten vragen van, joh, hier ligt een uitdaging, een probleem. Nou, ga eens geweldige ideeën bedenken en kom met een waardevol concept. En dan sluiten ze zichzelf op in een kamertje, gaan ze allerlei muren volschrijven, post-its gebruiken en dan eigenlijk hopen we dat daar iets zinnigs uitkomt, wat natuurlijk vaak niet het geval is. Ja. En wij zijn gaan denken van die manier van werken, als dat er niet werkt, wat kun je dan doen om misschien in eerdere fases studenten zo in een onderwerp te laten duiken of ze voor te bereiden, dat ze eigenlijk bijna gratis en voor niks dat idee al krijgen. Ja. En eigenlijk alleen maar zouden moeten brainstormen, dat idee wat we nu hebben, hoe gaat het dan echt uitpakken? Als het een concept is, wat moet het dan kunnen? Of als het een product is, wat voor features moet er dan op zitten? Of wat kan het nog meer dan de basisfuncties? Ja. Dat is een beetje hoe dat we naar het onderwerp kijken, denk ik.
Yeah, well, you know, I find very interesting that so many books are written about design thinking. And I am a designer. I'm trained as a designer. And back then, when I was in design school, I never read a book about these things because you learn in the practice. And I noticed that since the last 10 years, 15 years, there's so much being said and being done around those stapjes and sort of having the methods of design and design thinking in particular as sort for recipes for success. When in fact, in exactly what you're saying, identifying a context or a situation that needs an intervention, and you give students an opdracht of think about the context and have ideas, and then come back with a solution. And in fact, very often, the best approach to it is, okay, is there a problem? Okay, who is the problem owner? Who is involved in this problem? And going actually out there and talking with the people that recognize the situation as problematic. Because then you're not just the person coming up with ideas or studying the problem. You're actually harvesting from people what's their perspective of a situation that might be problematic. Because it could be that for some of the stakeholders, and I call it stakeholders as in the people who are involved somehow, whether in the problem or in the solution. But then you harvest from people their point of view, and no one can decide their point of view for them. You as a concept developer, as a marketeer, as a communications professional, you can bring in your own perspective. But I do think that your perspective is a better prepared one when you know the perspectives of those that have a direct relation with the problem. And I think that in different points in time in the creative process, it's super helpful, not only because to bring people together and to think along with people that have different perspectives. Because from the point of view of a student, the student, is a young professional learning with the advantage of not having the barriers of having been in the market. I noticed that as I grow older, I become more bureaucratized. I become more voorzinnig. I become more careful based on past experiences I had. And that limits the open-mindedness of my creativity. And that's why I like working with students so much, because I think working with students, you bring in, yes, that sense of experience. You have put so many times the pan in the cooking plate that you know that the pan is hot, so you know that you put your hand there, you're going to burn it. But because you never put your hand there anymore, you also remove yourself from the situation of exploring something new. And so I think if students are aware that it's fine to be younger and perhaps not have these limitations of experience, but they can really enrich their process if they look themselves as not the only, of course, if you're leading a project, you're the author and you're the person in the lead, but connect with stakeholders and connect with the people who share the concern or share the situation and bring their perspective along. I think...
Dus als we zeggen van nou weet je, die moeten die voorbereidingsfase verbeteren. Eigenlijk alles wat zich afspeelt al voordat die hele brainstorm begint. Dan is een van de belangrijkste dingen, zorg dat je het perspectief krijgt van degene die met het probleem te maken hebben. Dus ga met ze praten.
Yeah.
En zet je empathie aan het werk.
Yes, because it's funny that you mentioned the word empathy, because these are young people and they're still not just developing themselves as professionals, they're still developing their identities, their empathy. And empathy is so important for the rest of our lives, not only in our professions, especially in the creative sector, but also in our interactions and relationships with one another. I think that when the students, from my experience with students, the students that have engaged in an early process with people that are stakeholders in a certain problem or a situation, I think the students show not only better results, but also personal growth. And I think that's very important when we're talking about 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds who actively make the choice of being professionals in the creative sector. And I think empathy is a huge understated. It's not a skill, because it's not something that it's not like a Photoshop course that you can follow. Oh, now I'm going to become empathic. It's something in you. It's a human competence that you develop in interaction with others.
Kun je het activeren, denk je, dat empathische vermogen? Of zeg je van, zit het er al wel of heel beperkt, zeg maar, bij mensen? Hoe kijk je dat nu? Want het is heel interessant inderdaad, hè, dat echt proberen in te leven in die andere persoon. Is dat te doen bij studenten? Zeg je van, ik moet aan knopjes draaien, of is dat gewoon een proces waarin je ze mee moet nemen? Of dingen laten zien, voelen?
I think it is to do met studenten, but of course it needs to come from their initiative. I'm a firm believer that if you tell students, oh, now you have to go and do this, and this, people will do without wanting to do it. They do it because they're told to, and then the experience is different. But if you show the different ways on how they can get themselves involved in the context with people, I do think that people develop their empathic capacities. I mean, I give you an example. A few years ago, before I came to Fontes, I worked for the ING Bank, and I was there as a designer in the strategy department for customer experience. And people, and you go in the headquarters of a bank, you see most people wearing male people wearing gray, black, or blue suits, and I am different, and it's not better or worse, but people in my team then were very driven with efficiency and reducing costs and reducing time of discussion, its customer experience, but they weren't thinking so much about the quality of the experience and the effectiveness. And especially in big organizations like the banking industry, the financial sector, people thought I was crazy because as a strategist, we're supposed to be in the ivory tower of the hoofdkantoor. I wanted to go work with the people, actually talking with people. I wanted to meeluisteren. I wanted to meetypen op webcare, because you get a different sense of what type of service you need to deliver. And I remember an episode in particular of a woman that her husband had died, but things weren't arranged concerning what she could use, what she couldn't use. And the fact that you listen to this person in herself, so you're not just reading from the books, but you're listening to this person telling her story, you get connected with the reality of that person. So when you have in your responsibility come up with ideas for a service or for communication, and you experience in first person the pain of that person, whatever idea you're going to come up with, you're going to take that feeling in account because you're human. And unless you have a mental problem, it's hard for you not to feel the pain of somebody else if somebody's sharing that with you.
Maar het is dus wel zo, zeg jij, op het moment dat de studenten gaan vragen om dat te doen, dan moeten we het dus niet opleggen. Maar dan moeten we het eigenlijk een soort van hele zachte dwang gaan zeggen van, nou weet je, misschien in coaching, hè, van oké, je staat nu hier, ik zou zelf behoefte hebben aan dit. Ja. Wat zou je zelf willen doen? En dat ze dan zelf eigenlijk komen met een idee, nou ik zou met die kunnen gaan praten en zelf die keuze maken en daar ook eigenaar van zijn. Alleen dan gaat het werken.
Exactly, and I think that coaches play a super important role in inspiring students, in the sense that when students are confronted with a challenge and their opdracht for, I don't know, the project or the semester is to find, lead the process into a solution. Let's put it that way. There's aspects that the coaches, because they're well-seasoned professionals, especially in an hogeschool. I'm pretty sure that most people teaching have had a very practical experience in the field. There's aspects that can be really inspirational. For example, if on a certain moment in time you trigger the conversation with a group of students where they're sharing with each other the difference between tackling a challenge based on efficiency versus based on effectiveness. Because in efficiency, you may be disregarding effects and values and value creation that if you think from an effectiveness point of view, you will take in account. And these are abstract concepts, but you can illustrate them with very concrete situations. I can give you another example. With the lockdown, schools closed and suddenly all education had to become digital. I don't know the situation per se the home situation in ABO students, but I take into account that ABO students are already slightly privileged when you compare with the population of students in primary schools. Suddenly, all children had to go home, and it was expected they would have a computer at home, they would have broadband at home. And recently I talked with somebody who works for a stichting that supports children that come from underprivileged backgrounds. Something as simple as not having broadband. And sure, you design the whole system with the best intention on primary education so that children can learn at home, but you forget the fundamental aspect that these people don't have access to broadband. How are they going to do this? There's very interesting challenge, and very often it comes down to paradoxes, and it comes down to from our point of view, from our reality, we're designing for the reality of others, whether it's design, again, services or communication. When we're designing only from our reality, we're going to portray the situation. We're going to come up with a solution that in our eyes is very efficient, but in the eyes of people actually suffering from a situation or being directly related with a situation that needs to change, very often it happens that the solution doesn't fit. It's made with the best intentions. It may even be very empathically driven, but because you did not engage with people, you're designing from your own reality. And that's why, diversity in the creative process, it's not just a buzzword. Now that all communities and subcultures are exploding and being visible, when you bring the diversity of a context to the creative process, the solution for it is not only made according to your own reality, but according to the reality of those who actually are going to use it.
Ik heb nog nooit hierover nagedacht. Vind ik wel super interessant, George, in termen van effectiviteit en efficiëncy. Maar het raakt wel heel erg aan een vraagstuk waar ik eigenlijk volgens mij al 10 jaar mee rondloop. Want ik heb altijd het gevoel dat het onderzoek, zoals het op de hogeschool wordt uitgevoerd met en door studenten, is heel erg gericht op het verkrijgen van inzichten. En op zich is daar niks mis mee, maar het leidt volgens mij wel vooral juist tot die efficiënte oplossingen. En ik heb ook heel vaak het vraagstuk gehad van, ja, maar weet je, we verwachten niet alleen iets wat werkt, maar ook wat een originele component heeft en mensen echt raakt en verrassend is. En dan heb je niet alleen inzichten nodig, maar ook inspiratie. En dat onderzoek om die inspiratie te krijgen, dat weten we volgens mij heel moeizaam in te vullen. Dus ja, ik vraag me af, heb jij nou daar ervaring mee of suggesties voor? Van hoe kun je onderzoek nou zo inrichten dat het niet alleen inspiraties brengt, maar ook inzichten? Nee, niet alleen inzichten, maar ook inspiratie. Sorry.
Yeah, well, and it comes in the art sector. Sometimes you see research coming back in the form of artistic manifestations. That if you don't have a relationship with the art sector, if you're not interested in artistic experiments, you don't immediately see what symbolic this could bring. But it very often, especially in the example of technology, back then when I was working at the Stripe Festival, one of the very interesting things we thought was, on one hand, okay, we have an art and technology festival, so we make these installations that are quite impressive. And sometimes they're super big and they impress by the scale. Sometimes they're really small and they impress by the individual experience it creates. But what is very interesting is that sometimes you're using technologies that for people are not really meaningful, but because you have the label of being an artifact, you embody it in something tangible that people can experiment with. And then people understand, oh, this is what, for example, this is what a privacy leak would smell like. This is what happens when people are acquiring our data. This is what happens when I'm pushing accept in all the websites that nowadays have cookies. Basically, when you're clicking on accept, you're saying yes to a contract that if you open the clausures.
Ja, de voorwaarden, de algemene voorwaarden.
Yes. So I think there's typically case studies that from research you collect as a body of knowledge and evidence of situations that are new, and you can use those as examples to inspire. Specifically with technology, I think there's new technologies that people don't immediately understand what they can do with it. But when you involve, in a certain way, artists to give it a purpose and to give it a body, people can actually feel it. It becomes tangible. I remember a few years ago here in Eindhoven when people were discussing about self-driving cars. Self-driving cars already exist for years. The problem with self-driving cars is that from a law point of view, things are not developed enough for companies to be allowed to place these things in public space. But when you create it as an artistic experiment and an artistic manifestation, you can bring to public space and you can bring to people things that normally remain in being tested in laboratory. And the positive aspect of that is that people have first-person contact with these things and they can experiment what it means. I think coming back to your question, I think there's different types of research that have different types of purpose. In universities, the research that is more theoretical and fundamental, it's definitely useful to learn from more fundamental observations and see what kind of methods, experiments have been tested. Make sure that you bring into practice things that work. But on a practical level, especially for us in hogescholen, I think research in terms of gathering case studies for a specific context and bringing those case studies as inspiration for students is very interesting. But then not only gathering case studies, but based on those case studies, how do you create inspiration and how do you lead the students to not look at the case studies as something to copycat, but to inspire them, to open their eyes, to open their horizons and give them the freedom to, and not only the freedom, but also the safety, knowing that, okay, those things were experimented before and they worked. This is a new context. What could I do in this new context where I take inspiration from how in those different contexts things were thought of, and I get inspired to remain curious. Because ultimately, what is research? Research is you can find in different authors lots of definitions. I tend to think simple about it. Doing research is no more, no less than looking at the scientific discourse that is happening within a certain community, within a certain subject, somehow do a contribution to that discourse. And that contribution can be theoretical, it can be in new designs, in new ideas, in inspiration. And as long as you're gathering that knowledge and developing that knowledge in a way that can be shared with others and can contribute for others to have new ideas and new inspiration, research doesn't. It's a little bit old school that research is that thing that it's just writing papers. Sometimes doing interventions in public space requires so much research in the sense of what methods should we use and how are we going to engage people? How are you going to make sure if you have a complex structure of stakeholders, there's lots of different people that are involved in the same context, how do you make sure that you mediate dialogue between these different stakeholders in such a way that people feel represented, but that the situation is actually improving?
Je zegt als onderzoeker moet je dan uiteindelijk een bijdrage leveren aan het wetenschappelijke discours rondom een bepaald onderwerp. Hè? Vind ik wel heel interessant. En de manier waarop, dat kan dus op heel veel manieren. En je zegt dat proef ik een beetje vanuit universitaire achtergrond of opzicht, is dat een beetje papers schrijven. Nou, voor onze studenten is dat heel gauw een enquête doen of interviews doen. Maar er is dus zoveel meer eigenlijk om bij te dragen. En als we dan kijken naar, we hebben het de laatste tijd nog wel eens over die next level marketeer. Ja, dan zou die dus veel breder moeten gaan kijken. En bijvoorbeeld ook dat wat op de Hogeschool van de Kunst aan onderzoek wordt gedaan om inspiratie op te doen en te verkennen. Je zou een hele herwaardering ook moeten krijgen voor die gasties en die meiden in het economisch domein.
Yes, I mean, in marketing is such an interesting field because it's such in the tip over between the creative and artistic sector that is fundamentally focused on coming up with new ideas and concretize them. And in marketing, you have the purpose of market something. And then you have the economic aspect, which is, okay, you're marketing, you're coming up with these ideas to market something, a service, a product, whatever. And then you have the economic perspective, which is you're marketing something to create market value. What is market value in the 21st century? Is it only the euros? Is it the choices that people make? Is it the improvement of quality of living that it brings to people? And it's not that I find that making money or the euros are not important. As long as if you go to the supermarket, you need a bank pass with money on it to pay for the pack of milk, the money is important. But there's also other things that sometimes you bring to people that bring value to their existence. Does this make sense?
Ja, absoluut. Ja, volgens mij is het ook taal naar Coen zijn hart sowieso. Er moet geld verdiend worden. Maar het is natuurlijk ook, het is veel meer dan dat. Hè? Want je moet ook, zeker in de 21e eeuw, gaan kijken naar welke schade levert dat dan mogelijk op. En is het dan wel waard? Hè? Dus ethiek wordt dan heel belangrijk.
Ik vind value to existence vond ik wel een hele lekkere.
Ja.
Naast het geld. Ja.
Can I give an example? Yeah. And I'm not going to mention names because I was very fond of the No, I was very fond of the projects I saw in the competition for the best first year's project there at FET. And I was puzzled with one of the clients was Capi Europe. And I happen to know Capi Europe because I have visited their facilities before, so I know the product. I also know who are the slight audiences the product targets to. And it puzzled me the fact that in doing the exercise of positioning the product in the Netherlands, in Germany, and in France, that the students would assume a reality where society is male, female, 100% male and female, and over 25 years old, they're all married. And I mentioned this example to you before. The reason why I think this is an interesting example is because you can find out in research, if you do some research and you bring some inspiration from research, it doesn't mean research taking over the process, but research as a source of inspiration that can lead you to make conclusions that are more real. Because one interesting fact is that Capi Europe, because it's so light and because it has this orange interior, because it's of the characteristics of the product, it's extremely popular in a few minorities. And choosing to make a marketing campaign representing those minorities, it doesn't make the product being targeted at the minorities only, but it broadens, first of all, it's sellable to all other communities as well, including the male, female, married people. But it also promotes visibility of the fact that the world is diverse. And you see more and more this and yes, maybe, I don't know if that delivers money, but next to delivering the money, it will still do. It takes a role in mentality shifts in people. And you see, it's so strange that we live in a world where we're more connected, people have far more visibility, and yet you see more and more polarizations. And I think that especially brands that are considered cult brands, they can use their marketing capacity to not only sell their products, but also trigger a mentality shift and a mentality shift of bringing people together in a more peaceful way. And I think that comes back very often in the visions for social responsibility that some companies are developing more and more. And that is precisely an example where if you could have from research really interesting inspirations on how to reach non-audiences, audiences that are not, the general thing of married people, black, white people, male, female. How do you reach smaller audiences? That's something that research can definitely give inspiration. So that's coming back to the beginning, the brainstorming, so that when you come up with a solution, that the solution doesn't reflect your reality alone, but the reality of those who are going to consume the product or who are going to benefit from the solution you're coming up with.
Oké. Heel even terug naar eigenlijk wat we bespraken over we zouden breder moeten kijken met de studenten voor dat onderzoek. Hè? Ook dus bij de Hogeschool voor de Kunsten kijken. Echt alternatieve vormen inzetten. Of ja, wij noemen ze een alternatief, maar misschien is dat wel een verkeerde kwalificatie. Een volgend vraagstuk voor ons wordt dan altijd wel, weet je, die setting met die interviews en die enquêtes, die kunnen we prima toetsen. Dat zijn we gewend en we weten wat het al een beetje aan moet voldoen op hbo-niveau van wanneer is het goed en wanneer is het slecht. Maar dat wordt natuurlijk veel lastiger op het moment dat het veel meer open ligt. En ondertussen hijgen natuurlijk toetscommissies en visitaties ons wel in de nek van dat moet allemaal goed en geborgd en weet ik veel. Heb jij daar dan ideeën over hoe dat je dat dan zou moeten toetsen? Misschien zelfs nog wel los van of dat dan verantwoord is of niet, of wat verantwoord dan eigenlijk. Want misschien is het ook wel niet verantwoord om juist zeg maar je beperkt te voelen in het onderzoek door dat je het doet juist vanwege de borging of zoiets.
Yeah, of course, but I mean, I think two different things is how you use, how you perform different forms of research, and that is a technical aspect. And how do you use the outcomes of that research in the creative process? Mm-hmm. And that is less of a technical aspect. It's more on how do you juggle with those elements? If you can be really good in designing interviews and performing the interviews, studying the data of the interviews, and getting research from literature, understanding that Googling something is not per se doing research. But that doesn't per se mean that you're going to bring it in a creative way, in a way that is super inspiring. But then again, how do you define inspiring? And
That's difficult. It's difficult. Maar ik zit nou wel te denken, en misschien wil je daarop reageren. Wat ik dan eigenlijk een beetje proef, namelijk als je zegt van ja, weet je, het maakt niet eens zoveel uit welke onderzoeksvorm je kiest. Je kunt gewoon toetsen, is die keuze, zit daar een goede verantwoording achter? En is het vervolgens in technisch opzicht redelijk of goed uitgevoerd? En dan vervolgens, het levert bepaalde inzichten bijvoorbeeld op. Dus dat wat er uit het onderzoek doet, doe je daar ook de goede dingen mee in je creatieve proces en uiteindelijk naar je oplossing toe?
Yeah, I think like the education process and the evaluation process, and those are different parts of a machine. Mm-hmm. A machine that has research and inspiration, and then you have the education process, and then you have the education and then the criteria for the education. And you have to look at the qualities of the mechanism as a whole. And I will explain you what I mean by this. What's the best car that you know, in your opinion?
Cool. Coen, jij ging een nieuwe auto halen.
Ja, gewoon een Mini, kom op.
A Mini. Okay, so the Mini is the best car that there is. What is the function of the Mini?
En de pure functie is van A naar B brengen.
En in jouw geval snel.
Ja, en snel, ja. Met binnenbochten.
Ja, dus. Maar, if you split all the parts of the Mini, those parts individually don't have the capacity of moving you from A to B. They have different functions, but it's when you bring those functions together that it acquires a collective function, which is moving from A to B. I think that we need to zoom out from only the education process, only the research process, and only the evaluation process, and having a bigger picture on what is it that we want to achieve. How are we going to catalyze that with different people that are in the system, having a system approach to it? Because very often what you see in organization is that every time there's quality control, you're going to do quality control on that piece, and on that piece, and on that piece. But you're not looking at the big picture, and the big picture is what you want to change. So you have to have a more systemic approach. And if you bring it down to education and the toetsing, if you guys would give an architect an opdracht to design your house, I'm guessing the architect would use his own methods or her own methods to investigate who you are and interview and know what you look for in a house. And regardless of how good that research is, if at the end they give you a tent and that's not what you expected, if that's not the purpose, regardless of how good the research is, the result doesn't serve the purpose. And I think that and I'm not saying only the result is important, especially evaluating students. It's good to see how did they lead the process. The process is very important. But I do feel that sometimes we disregard how the result is also important, because there's always a match between what was set as a purpose and what is being delivered as a result. If you go in the market in the future, if you're a student, you graduate and you go in the market and you have never had a successful experience between having an opdracht and delivering a result that addresses what the opdracht is about, I do think that you're lacking that positive experience. So coming back to your question, hoe te toetsen? I think we should rethink parameters concerning process, and we should think about parameters concerning the matching of opdracht and result. Because you can come up with super creative ideas, but what is creativity? It's about looking at the situation and identifying whatever problem is in that situation or opportunity, and based on that knowledge and on who others see the reality of that problem, that you create you move from situation A to situation B, hopefully hopefully using the instruments that you have at your disposal, in this case creativity instruments or research instruments, but at the end that you deliver something that people are happy with.
Okay, I have one last question for you, George.
Yes, of course.
Because if we don't take the initiative to finish this conversation, you will go on and on and on, I guess. Which in itself is fine, but we have listeners with a certain time limit, I guess.
Yeah.
My final question would be, but maybe Coen has another question. Je zegt daar straks, eigenlijk een beetje aan het begin, ik heb ontzettend veel gelezen over design thinking.
Ja.
In de afgelopen 10 en 15 jaar is er ook veel over verschenen. Heb jij een absoluut favoriet boek daarover? Waar je zegt, van dat zou ik nou echt aan anderen aanraden om te lezen.
Well, the book we used to use in the Future Media Lab, 101 Design Methods, I thought it was an interesting book because regardless of, I don't think the success of a design of whatever, again, marketing or product or whatever, I don't think the success of the design comes from the methods. I do think it comes from choosing, depending on which content, which method combinations you need. I think that is an interesting book. I think for those hardcore designers, if I can get up, can I get up for a moment and get it?
Of course.
Why not?
Kijk wij wel even, Coen, heb jij een favoriet boek erover of niet?
Oh, dat vind ik wel lastig hoor. Want ik vind dat 101 vind ik redelijk, maar niet echt lekker om door te komen hoor. Die hebben we al een keer behandeld trouwens in onze Fack TV, hè?
Dus het is zeker interessant, maar het is ook voor studenten is die nog best hoogdrempelig, vind ik.
Ja,
Eigenlijk zijn mijn favoriete boeken over design thinking toch die van de gebroeders Kelly. En dan denk ik aan 10 Phases of Innovation. En die is al van Tom. Maar David en Tom Kelly hebben samen ook Creative Confidence geschreven. En dat vind ik eigenlijk ook wel een heel goed boek. Wat heel laagdrempelig de principes van design thinking uitlegt. Maar George is terug, dus ik ga het ons laten zien.
George is terug. So this is the book that we used to use in the Future Media Lab.
101 Design Methods. Yeah.
Yes, and this has a very interesting collection of different methodologies that you can use, really approaching methodologies as tools that you use. And sometimes, if you want to just write an email, you use Outlook, and if you want to write the text, you use Word, if you want to make it pretty. So I look at methodologies like tools that I choose depending on the meal that I want to cook. For the more hardcore onderzoekers, there's just this book launched, and I received it to review it, and it has specific methodologies for research. So, for example, designing questionnaires and interviews, if you want to extract patterns from the people that you're interviewing, there's specific methodologies that you use. You don't just list questions and then that's it. You actually can follow techniques to make sure that from the knowledge you're gathering from people, you find patterns. And based on those patterns, then you identify which direction your solution could go.
Nou, je liet het zien aan de camera, maar dit wordt straks een podcast. Dus mensen weten nog niet over welk boek het gaat. Kun je de titel geven en de auteur?
It's called Onderzoeksmethode en de redactie door Peer Schepers en Hilde Toby.
Oké, en dat is van uitgeverij Boom, zag ik, hè?
Yeah, and then I have a final tip that I used myself at some point. I'm showing you, and I'm going to
Sketching User Experiences.
Sketching User Experiences, the workbook by Sol Greenberg, Shailang Carpendale, Nikolai Markart, and Bill Buxton. Bill Buxton, by the way, is quite well known in the field of design. And what I'm showing you these books, not so much because I think, oh, this is where you're going to find the Holy Grail. I tend to use a lot of metaphors. When we were young and we were learning English in school, we had English workbooks. So in the workbooks, we would see exercises that we could practice. And little by little, you learned words, and then you learned sentences, and then you learned paragraphs. And these books basically give exercises to experiment something. But just because you experimented with the exercise books in English, it doesn't make you a literature writer. So it's in the experience that you build in maturing point of view, in enriching your own reality, and developing an empathic quality, that at some point the English writing exercise, and I'm doing quotes for those who are not seeing me, so I will say it. So the English exercise book is a metaphor. I'm not telling anybody to go to the English exercise books. What I mean is, you learn the techniques, you can learn the techniques, but it's in the use and in the interaction with others that you get richer as a person and that you become a more mature, creative professional.
Wow, mooie metafoor. Wederom.
Ja. Mag ik dan ook de laatste vraag? Heel even klein vraagje, hoor.
Zeker.
Wat ik interessant vond in het begin en wat je zei. God, ik ben ouder geworden. En... lelijk, nee. Ouder geworden. En als ik dan kijk naar studenten, dat is best wel een verschil. De studenten zijn ook eigenlijk nog fris, hè, onbevangen zijn in het begin. En je ziet dat juist wij wellicht inderdaad wel veel ervaring en veel andere inzichten hebben. Maar dat je ook als een beetje gevormd bent, zeg maar. En hoe kun je nou het beste zo'n mix samenstellen? Want ik snap wat je zegt, want studenten zijn nog vrij onbevreesd, onbevangen. Maar aan de andere kant ook nog niet ervaren. Is er een mix te vinden en hoe je daar samenwerking in kunt doen? Want dan zou je natuurlijk het mooiste met elkaar hebben. Een stukje onbevangenheid vanuit de student in een creatieve fase, maar ook wel een stukje ervaring van iets ouder. Wat is daar de beste combi in dan?
Yeah, well, I do think at Fontes I've never seen this, but in the TUE, for example, where I worked in the past in the Department of Design, we sometimes brought together in teams students from the master program and students from third years and students from second years, and the students would learn from each other. And what was really nice is that the process always started with having good conversations with the students. And I think you guys have the same approach of not as a teacher, not taking that role as in, oh, I'm the teacher and I'm here to give you knowledge and you're here to put it into practice. But instead engage in conversations that can be inspirational, that help the students find their own qualities, find their passions. And normally when people follow their passions, they're happy people. And I think that's a good start for you to find yourself as a professional, for you to find in that profession, what are the aspects that you like the most and that you want to develop the most. And then, when you find partners, whether they're older or the same age, that have other passions and other interests and other skills that are complementary with yours, volgens mij is het niet makkelijk, maar het is de kunst van die matches in passie en interesses vinden. En daar kan de school en de docent veel betekenen, hoor.
Oké. Joris, van de tijd ben jij. Nee, op een gegeven moment. Maar we hebben niet eens voorgesteld, joh.
Nee, maar dat doen we wel in een introotje. Stellen we George wel even voor.
Doen we dat.
En we bouwen misschien nog een mooi uitrootje. Super bedankt, George. Heel interessant gesprek waar we weer verder over kunnen nadenken. We kunnen ook weer even leggen naast dingen die we al gemaakt hebben en in gedachten hebben. Erg verrijkend. En superleuk wat mij betreft. Dus super bedankt.
Dankjewel.
Nou, jullie bedankt. Tot de volgende keer.
Tot de volgende keer. Fascinerend toch weer?
Nou, ik moet toegeven. Het heeft best wel een aantal leuke, interessante inzichten meegegeven die ik in eerste instantie helemaal niet had gedacht. Ik kijk Tessel tegen een aantal zaken anders aan. Dus daar moet ik hem toch wel een pluim voor geven eigenlijk. En voor ons, hij heeft mij in ieder geval weten te beraken en in ieder geval tot nadenken aangezet. En dat lukt heel veel mensen niet.
Nee, hij heeft echt wel krachtige metaforen die je dan even opnieuw laten nadenken over thema's waar je behoorlijk vooringenomen over bent.
Vooringenomen, ja, dat is een hele mooie. En daar moeten we wel even een stapje terug voor nemen. Daar ben ik toch even iets minder nu.
En daar kunnen we volgens mij ook weer van profiteren bij de dingen die wij maken. Dus,
super interessant, ja. En nu? Nog één podcast hierna of niet?
Ja, we gaan er nog eentje opnemen. Dus binnenkort zijn we weer bij... Nee, we gaan denk ik nog 2 opnemen. Eentje nog met een gast. En dan eventjes, dat zal denk ik niet zo'n heel lange zijn. Dan proberen we kernachtig te houden. Onze eigen slotevaluatie of een soort van wrap-up. Mooi Engels woord voor samenvatting, denk ik. Wat hebben we er nou van geleerd en wat nemen we mee? En hoe vertalen we dat naar concrete onderwijsproducten? Of met een heel mooi woord, artefacten.
Artefacten, schitterend. Nou, ik vond het leuk, interessant.
Yes.
Dankjewel voor het luisteren en tot de volgende.
Tot de volgende, groeten.
Hoi hoi.